If you're a woman who's been grinding away at the gym for months or even years with minimal muscle growth to show for it, you might be wondering if it's your genetics, age, or even hormones. You've tried increasing protein, lifting heavier, and following programs designed by top coaches, yet the results remain frustratingly slow. What if I told you the problem isn't your effort or your genetics, but rather the training principles themselves? Today, world champion bodybuilder and nutrition expert Holly Baxter joins me to reveal the science-backed strategies that actually work for women's unique muscle building needs. You'll discover why the fitness industry is confusing all of us, the real truth about hormones and muscle growth, and how to break through those stubborn plateaus even with less time in the gym. Listen up if you want to finally build that strong aesthetic physique you've been wanting. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that helps you build a strong, healthy physique using evidence, engineering, and efficiency. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and today we get into the science of optimizing training for women with the incredible Holly Baxter. Holly is an accredited practicing dietitian with over 13 years of experience in nutrition and training. She's a two-time world champion in the natural fitness division, IFBB Bikini Pro, author, educator, and creator of Be a Fit, an innovative new fitness app with lots of science-backed workout programs and hundreds of macro-friendly recipes. And today you're going to learn about training strategies that work specifically with the female physiology, the truth about things like hormones, muscle development, how to avoid mistakes that keep women from achieving their muscle building goals from the very best, who's done it herself and worked with lots of women like you. We're going to get into recovery, tracking, nutrition, and more. Holly, it is so good to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So let's just jump right into it. You know, a lot of women are trying to build muscle, trying to develop the physique. They might see you on, social media, follow you, and perhaps they've been doing some of the right things, let's say. Maybe they've gotten some of their habits dialed in. They listen to this show, they follow you, they know some of the basics of training and nutrition. Even then, what would you say is like the biggest factor that holds most women back from their muscle building potential?
Oh, I think this is a very clear, distinct winner. I would say their inability or unwillingness to commit to a muscle building phase.
Okay, that's a good one.
I think most women tend to be ready to go in terms of fat loss, which I can fully, condone. I get behind. I think, there's a time and a place for that, but to their own detriment, I think a lot of folks will pursue fat loss over the extremely important muscle building phase that's going to allow them to actually make progress, in the future.
Yeah, so that's good because I know you probably talk about fat loss a lot. It comes up, and nutrition, and we talk people's ears off about that. But I've tried to get that message out, and I feel like someone yourself, being a woman, having a certain experience in the past, I know, gone through disordered eating and, the whole physique competition journey, that you can very much relate to the fears as to why they don't want to do that. Is it really the gaining weight and the getting bulky? Is there something deeper than that? What is your thought on that?
I think there's unfortunately just low confidence and a lot of negative body image, for a lot of females that I work with. And I think because I've been so open and just transparent about my experiences over the last decade, in the bodybuilding sphere, I think people have felt a little bit more comfortable kind of opening up and sharing their own struggles. And I mean, it's been a really long and challenging journey for me too. I'd say I wouldn't have been able to work through that myself without professional help. So speaking to my eating disorders, so I'd say from about age 15 through to age 25, I struggled with an eating disorder. I had bulimia and binge eating disorder. And I think for the longest time, I spent all my efforts, all my mental energy, all my physical energy, like doing the things that I was really good at, which was training like a Trojan and putting in the work like in a physical sense. But I kind of lacked accountability and didn't take any responsibility for my psychological state. And I think that I just assumed that I could outwork it. And, it was a sad and false reality that I carried. And it wasn't really until I started working with a psychologist to kind of work through that and, provide some pushback and challenge that negative narrative that I held for myself, did I then finally start to make progress in a healthy way. So I think that women do need to take some responsibility in improving how they view themselves. And it is a really huge obstacle to overcome. But I think if you're intentional about it, if you do the work, if you do the reading and find somebody that, can support you through that, there is a wonderful existence on the other side that still affords you to make, improvements to your body composition, but you also still feel so much better about yourself as a person. I think I used to, put so much value and weight into physical appearances. And I never, gave myself enough credit for the other qualities and characteristics that just make me a good person until I started focusing on those things and really shifting my perspective about how I viewed myself. I was in the same boat, but I think that's a really important component of getting to where you want to be with your physical body. But I also think lack of knowledge and understanding about how our bodies and our biology works. So I think through, lack of nutrition education and understanding, that too is also another big thing that holds a lot of people back in making progress. And there is so much misinformation available on social media. I think it's really a hard time to know what's truthful and what's, complete nonsense. So, finding the right professionals to kind of help you navigate through that is a critical piece in this too.
I totally agree. I mean, that's why I started this podcast, following individuals like you and trying to learn as much as possible and know that physiology is, there's science to it and there's experience and anecdote as well. But at the end of the day, you also have to discover what works for you individually based on that. And it is a whole process. I love how you said a wonderful existence on the other side, hitting right into identity. And you said, the qualities that make you a good person. That hits hard of me as well, because you could get so hung up in the outcome and the physical side that you don't address the psychology, which then makes the outcome very much easier to attain, almost like a side bonus, unless you're talking about physique competition where you have to really dial it up to that next level. So we're talking about women, but and I'm a man, so enlighten me here, but are there differences that we really do need to pay attention to versus those we don't? And what I mean by that is there's principles, right? There are training principles, there's nutrition principles, physiology. That is kind of the same no matter who you are, and it has to be individualized regardless. What would you say for women specifically are the things that they need to pay attention to beyond that? That makes sense.
Yeah. So I think in terms of muscle, physiology and muscle growth, I actually have an entire chapter on sex differences in my book, actually, which talks and plays into this probably a lot more in depth than what I will cover today. But I think first and foremost, we do need to identify that there are some baseline physiological differences between men and women. So men do tend to have a greater total amount of skeletal muscle mass compared to women. And that has been observed in a number of different research studies. So one that springs to mind was by Albay and colleagues, and I think there's another one by Gallagher and colleagues, and they used a combination of DEXA and MRI, which MRI is the gold standard for measuring muscle cross-sectional area. So in those research investigations, it does clearly show that men have more skeletal muscle, but it tends to be disproportionately greater in the upper body. So men will have somewhere between 30 to 60% more muscle in their upper body compared to women. But if we then look at the female's physique, we tend to carry a greater amount of our muscle mass, thankfully, in my opinion, in our lower bodies. And, that kind of checks out. I think, I can observe that in myself. I'm sure we observe that in ourselves and the clients that we work with. So to me, that doesn't really come as any kind of surprise. But does that actually interfere or have any influence on our ability to build muscle? No. And there doesn't really seem to be any differences in response to different training stimulus either, between men and women, which is great. We're kind of all on an even playing field. So if we take a look at some of the research, generally what we would expect to see in terms of muscle growth adaptations in response to a resistance training program. And usually most of the studies that we look at are somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks in duration. And the norm or the average change in muscle thickness as measured by what's usually B mode ultrasound, that's one that's most commonly used in exercise science because it's a little bit more affordable. It's a lot more difficult to get your hands on an MRI and the cost goes up astronomically with those types of measurement tools. but 0.2 to 0.3 centimeters would be a typical like muscle thickness increase over that time frame. Now, as a percentage or a relative change, we might anticipate, muscle growth being somewhere in the realm of like 6 to 10% over that time frame. Now, if we were to look at males' data, we might see males are increasing by, 0.4, say, of a centimeter. So we're doing 4 millimeters over that time span. Whereas a female you might see a response of 0.2, for instance. But if we look at that relative change or that percentage increase in muscle thickness, they're not statistically different. They're basically the same. So that's great. It means that, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, if you do your resistance training, if you train hard, we all have the same potential to build muscle. But there is one area that I will say women might actually have a slight advantage. And I say might for a couple of reasons. So a lot of the research that looks at this particular outcome has been done in isometric exercise, which is basically where you, contract your muscle, and you go to failure or to exhaustion, but you're not taking it through a full range of motion. So that type of training, what we would typically do in the gym is called isotonic training. So in this isometric literature, it does seem to indicate that women might be slightly more fatigue resistant. And that might be in part due to like our hormonal differences. So women tend to have more estrogen than males, and that can help with vasodilation and nutrient delivery. But women also tend to have more capillarization too. So I guess the benefits for that would mean that women have slightly better muscle perfusion, which is essentially like better blood flow delivery to our muscle, and therefore also better clearance of some of those metabolic byproducts that accumulate within our muscle when we do a working set. So I guess the benefits with having more capillarization and maybe, more estrogen than our male counterparts is that we probably have, and again, this is not consistent in the isotonic research, but it is consistent in the isometric research, is that we might be better at recovering between sets. And thus, we might also be better at responding to short rest periods. And I think this is really important because I know so many of us ladies are always extremely busy. We're always rushed, and, you want to be able to do something efficiently. So potentially being able to call upon short rest periods for resistance training, or at least be able to do it better than males, again, in some studies, might actually be a bit of an advantage. So short of those things, there aren't really any other differences that I can think of from a biological standpoint that would mean women don't have the same potential to build muscle as men. And before I forget, there is one another area as well. I remember seeing a paper, I think it was by Western colleagues, don't quote me on the year, but it was a few years ago, and they were looking at muscle protein synthetic response rates in response to like an acute resistance training session. And despite some pretty significant differences in their hormone levels after that bout of exercise, I think they were looking at testosterone and a handful of others, there were some appreciable differences in testosterone response. But despite those hormonal differences between the men and the females in this study, the muscle protein synthesis was actually very similar. It remained elevated, between men and women. So I think this is all really good news.
Yeah. And that last one, it just makes you realize how complex physiology is, right? You can't simplify it to just testosterone if, one sex has just leagues more of this particular hormone and it doesn't make a difference. Incredible. Yeah. So just to recap, women have a lower baseline muscle mass, which makes sense. We know that women have higher body fat and there's biological reasons for that, but can build at the same rate and ostensibly forever, right? There's really no age limit. You keep building muscle. And then the fatigue resistant aspect, that is fascinating. I know what you're talking about where we kind of don't know, and there's several mechanisms we're trying to understand, but the idea that you could have more efficient workouts is cool. What about the recovery between sessions? Is that affected as well for like volume and frequency?
I probably haven't done as much reading in that area specifically, but I mean, if I were to speculate, I think there's probably always going to be like a certain amount of recoverable training volume. And I think that we can probably adapt to increasing training volumes over time too. So, when someone's first starting out, if they're a beginner, I would have to speculate that initially, if you did a certain amount of training volume, you'd probably find that you didn't recover very well from that stimulus. But the more you do it, there's that general adaptation. Neurological adaptations, you're better able to handle that volume moving forward. So I don't know that I've seen any specific studies that compare, training response or recovery times. But yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to that.
How much do we know, Holly? Other than just get in the gym, train, and figure it out. But yes,
exactly.
It's funny because volume and intensity get a lot of play, and especially on the podcast, and there's a lot of confusion. And even from personal experience, I just did what you would call a volume-based program where you're progressing to build your base with lots and lots of sets, but highly submaximal. So there's multiple training variables involved, and that's where it gets confusing. More volume could be more recoverable than less if you're at a lower load, for example. That's just what comes to mind. What about peri and postmenopause? A very hot niche in like marketing in the fitness industry, and other than the Ozempic crowd, right? The GLP-1 crowd. It's, so many, I don't want to say excuses, but like a lot of the marketing is around everything is changing in your life now because of the hormonal differences. And so you've got to have specific training, you've got a specific diet, specific this. What are your thoughts on that in general? But then where are the legitimate changes where a woman who, her estrogen has dropped, progesterone's dropped, she needs to consider the changes that come along with that?
Yeah, I think I'll probably start off with a disclaimer. So I haven't personally published any research in menopausal or postmenopausal females. All of the work that I've been involved in are in young individuals that are still menstruating, or males, of course, as well. So from what I have read, unfortunately, there is not a lot of data at the moment in that particular study population. I know it's becoming more and more popular, and I'm really excited to see, where that line of research goes. I think Dr. Stu Phillips has been doing a lot of work up in Canada, specifically focusing on, this group of individuals. But I think generally speaking, we do know that, with age, our sex hormones specifically do start to decline. And for women, testosterone is starting to decline, estrogen is starting to decline at about age 30. And it continues to do that, through to the end of life, basically. And whilst I don't know that would necessarily have any direct implications on how much muscle we can grow, I believe that some of the symptoms of low testosterone and low estrogen can become problematic if you are aspiring to have a high degree or a high amount of muscle mass, just through its capacity to leave you feeling exhausted and like fatigued. So if you're not feeling very energized due to having low testosterone or low estrogen levels, it's a lot harder to stay motivated and, show up regularly and consistently and lift. Not to mention then lift with any degree of intensity. And we know how important proximity to failure is for muscle growth. So I think that might be another area where, unfortunately, a lot of women, and I have worked with a lot of women in the gym as well over the years, and we might perhaps, and I don't want to generalize too much because I've also trained with some women that train really hard, but I might say on average, maybe more women struggle to really train at that rate of perceived exertion that is going to be effective for eliciting muscle growth. There was a meta-analysis that came out just last year, I believe, by the data-driven strength guys here in Florida, actually. And they found that somewhere between an RPE of 7 through 10 seems to elicit, similar muscle growth responses. But there are probably a number of people that don't necessarily train in that degree of effort. And it's not because they're lazy or, they're not competent or able. I think sometimes it all also comes down to like our confidence in the gym, especially for older women that may not have grown up in this fitness space. Like I think of my mom, for instance. She's in her, late 50s, women in their 60s. Like fitness and lifting weights wasn't something that was super popular. So they've kind of adopted resistance training a little bit later in life and may not feel as confident as, us, that have been in the gym for, 2 decades almost, as in, in my case. So I think there's probably also, the element of I don't really feel very confident in doing this, or they don't have a workout buddy or someone that they're, training with that gives them that support and encouragement to train hard and truly take their muscles to failure. But to bring the conversation back to the menopause in general, I think all of the principles that I use with my younger clients are the same principles that I use with my older clients. And I don't want to call them old because they're not in their 70s. I'm talking 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it probably means that for this demographic, we need to be a little bit more focused and dialed in, because what I might be able to get away with in terms of my protein intake, my calories, the consistency of my lifting, my sleep, my stress, it probably needs to dial up a few notches relative to my younger self. So outside of that, I think everything that I teach is basically the same, but we probably need to focus a little bit more.
So that's a good point, because there's a dichotomy here where the older, my older clients, and again, older, I'm 44 and, whatever, 44 years young, that sometimes they're also more committed and willing to do that and to learn. There's in a different, more mature life state in terms of their wisdom and their hard knocks of life. And again, not to generalize, but sometimes that counteracts some of what you're saying, which makes total sense. But in general, for any age, you mentioned RPE, you mentioned exertion and working hard. The confidence, how can you build that? You mentioned a training partner. We know somebody can get coaching and support, but let's say they were by themselves. Is there an actual training approach, like using plus sets at the end of your sets to figure out what your true capability is? Something like that, where you'd say, this is a cool technique you can try to really push yourself without it being a willpower thing.
Yeah, look, I think I probably implement a little bit more low load training with my 40 plus clients. And honestly, that's probably 90% of my the people that I work with. And there's a couple of reasons I implement low load training. And I best give a definition of what that is first. So typically when we look at, ways or approaches to build muscle, we can implement high load training, which is taking relatively heavy loads for fewer reps. So to generalize, that's your traditional strength training, 8 to 15 repetitions. Low load training is where we take lighter weights and we perform a higher number of repetitions. So that might be, somewhere between 15 all the way up to 90 reps. And believe it or not, there are studies, one here, in fact, at the University of South Florida, that did 90 rep sets to failure. And they were able to accomplish the same hypertrophy response as the group that did the traditional resistance training. So I think that that's good, because we've got such a broad spectrum of training strategies and approaches that allow you to grow muscle. But as we get older, at least in my experience, and even me personally, I say my experience, my clientele, but even for me, when I was doing, some powerlifting training, I found that my joints were getting sore. I was getting injured, and I was in my 30s then, and getting, some problems that I wasn't experiencing, short outside of doing very heavy training. So, I do get that feedback a lot from clients that are kind of coming in for the first time, where they've tried that traditional high load training and they're, just feeling the wear and tear on their body perhaps a little bit more, because of the aging process. So the strategy that I use to help build confidence is the reliance on low load training a little bit more. So we do, higher rep ranges, slightly lighter loads, but taking it to failure, or at least very near to still elicit a very good muscle growth response. And you can also, I guess, improve and build confidence in training to failure with light loads, which is inherently safer, with techniques like myo reps, which is basically perform an initial set of 15 repetitions, rest for a really short period of time, I think 10 to 15 seconds, followed by an 8 rep set, and then you rest again, followed by another 8 rep set. So you basically kind of cluster, this group of exercise with really short rest periods, light loads, but you can get very close to failure doing that. And the research would indicate that can lead to similar growth responses. You could also try approaches like blood flow restriction training. So that's where, you're applying a tourniquet or some kind of cuff to the proximal portion of the arm or the leg, you're using significantly lighter loads, and you can still take that set to failure, but in a much safer way rather than relying on really heavy loads as per traditional training to signal muscle growth. So that's kind of the approach that I take. And of course, you've got to take everybody case by case.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, are a lot more confident in the gym. Maybe they did some kind of sport, when they were younger and they're just a little bit more athletic. But I've got people right now who are in their 60s and this is the first time they've ever been into a gym. They've got various like physical issues and limitations. And it's a process, but I think you meet them where they're at. And, as you see them starting to grow in curiosity and confidence, like the ball just starts rolling, and it's really cool to see.
Yeah. And this is why there's so many approaches, right, that can work. And you mentioned the rep range is massive. I mean, anywhere from, 2 to 90 reps if you were to combine all regimes together. And we're talking specifically hypertrophy. We don't want to get too much into maybe strength and big lifts like you alluded to. I've had folks on the show who they're all into that. And then others that say, look, machines are just as effective as free weights. And the answer is yes to all of it. Like, meet you where you're at and make sure you're training hard and within the proximity to failure. So I like that technique for individuals who feel like, maybe the big squats aren't for them, or they've tried it, or they're intimidated. Okay. So we kind of alluded to earlier, I think, not dieting, and that you need to build muscle, at least be in maintenance, at least be gaining. Combining that with your training, what are your thoughts on periodization for someone? And again, our audience is I guess we're not talking to the total beginner necessarily, or like a little bit step above that, who kind of understands macros and a little bit of this, but just break down what effective periodization looks like when we're talking hypertrophy as the goal.
Look, I think periodization has its place within a training program, but I think, the concept in general was initially founded to help mitigate external stresses. So essentially we would look at, let's say, the elite sporting athlete who's, trying to compete in their, let's say it's a football game, or they're doing basketball or something like this. This concept or this idea of periodization is to help mitigate and limit external stress from other outside sources. So basically, as the stress of one thing starts to increase, we kind of want to taper down, the other, to make sure that there's some sense of balance and that the person isn't dealing with too much at any one time. So I don't know that I would necessarily utilize periodization in my resistance training profiles or programs for clients unless they have multiple different stresses or interests. So if they came to me and said, look, I'm a professional athlete, I also care about muscle, I also am interested in doing a marathon, in 6 months' time. They've got a lot of different interests. Then I think there's probably some relevance for periodizing a program. But for the average person who's just going into the gym, who's wanting to improve strength to a certain degree, but their primary goal is just hypertrophy, I don't know that there is a whole lot of need to implement a periodized approach, because we should just be focusing on one training program that is helping them achieve their muscle growth. And I mean, if there's no other competing stress, then we don't really need to periodize. So I don't know whether does that make sense?
It does. I'm so glad you took that approach and didn't let me lead you to what you thought I was trying to get to, because I would agree.
There's a lot of conversation around daily undulating periodization or linear periodization. So again, I think those approaches work well, perhaps for individuals that have strength specific goals, but they're also wanting to lift for muscle growth. So I know a lot of power lifters, for instance, would benefit from implementing some kind of periodized training approach, because they're trying to manage the fatigue from their hypertrophy training whilst they're also trying to maximize strength. So there's probably a greater need in those instances to include that type of training approach. But I think for someone like myself, or maybe the people that are listening, if you're just going into the gym with the goal of improving your metabolic health, growing some muscle, and in turn also, making some improvements in strength, that's probably not as important. I think, I want to minimize the complexity of someone's program. So minimal is best.
No, it's good to identify who it's appropriate for, and it depends on your goals, right? If you're an endurance athlete and you're going to do some big cycling race in 6 months, you may have to back off from that and decide how you train now versus how you train closer to the race. Or if you're an athlete, or, if you are building strength, there's like a base and a peak, phase you would go through, and you wouldn't want to be doing, 7 lifts a day type bodybuilding training when you're going for the peak. But for most people, like you said, keep it simple. There is a lot of program hopping, and we're not talking about that either. How committed should someone be to a single program style or an actual program for, in terms of weeks or months, when they're just trying to get the best result, keep it simple, keep going, before they maybe get tired of it? Is it psychological, like when you just get bored of it and you're ready to move on? Or is there a point where the variety is necessary for extra stimulus and symmetry and development of your physique?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I'm sure we have so I have a research review where each month we publish, 4 different articles on different topics in relation to exercise science and nutrition. And I feel like we did one very recently that looked at exercise variety versus like a very repetitive, very repetitive style of training program. And I think there are potentially some benefits to exercise variety if the exercises are targeting different joints, different angles, and also potentially different muscle groups within like a specific area. So I think, to give an example, like a leg press or a squat probably does a really good job at targeting not only the rectus femoris, but the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis. So 3 different areas within our quad. Whereas like a leg extension, that does a fantastic job at, I believe, just, nailing and hammering the vastus lateralis, that big muscle down the front of the leg. So, in a sense, you probably want to have a combination of different types of exercises to ensure that you're covering all of your bases. But ultimately, if you have a specific set of training goals, and I'll just use my own right now because it's a really easy example to talk about, because I'm a bikini competitor, all I care about is my glutes and my shoulders. I do not care about anything else at the moment. Sorry, the majority of my work and time spent in the gym is those 2 muscle groups. Everything else is a secondary focus. So provided that your program is set up to specifically target the muscle groups you care about, if there is enough diversity within those exercises, like we've kind of just described, there's technically no need for you to ever change your program, because, if you've got 5 staple movements that are targeting the muscles that you want to grow, then in essence, you could do that same program for an entire year, provided that your goals didn't change. Now, of course, you'd need to implement all of the, typical principles of hypertrophy, training with a high degree of effort, implementing progressive overload, and, that would obviously increase your rate of perceived exertion over time. But yeah, short of that, I think the biggest reason why I change my program is just for enjoyment, like program excitement, program motivation. It's about 6 weeks for me where I'm like, yep, I'm ready for a new program. I don't know about you, but it's about that time frame.
Yeah, it sounds about right. 6 weeks, 6 to 9 weeks, I would say. Yeah, that's right in the bailiwick. Okay, so what about, if we're not necessarily having to periodize, and we're not necessarily having to change the program frequently, which is good, it keeps it simple, straightforward, you commit, you develop. I think there's a lot of, like you mentioned, neuromuscular adaptation. There's aspects that you just in the first week, you have that soreness, and then you get adapted, and now you're growing. What about the different phases of nutrition that go with that? Because people will say, well, what should I do during fat loss versus not? Because my opinion is, if it's auto-regulated, it can all work in all phases, versus, say, chasing PRs, which is going to be very difficult in fat loss when you don't have as much energy. But there's also a volume component too, right? Like you almost sometimes can't work as much in fat loss. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So, I have definitely been through my fair share of fat loss phases.
Of course.
I'm for those right now, unfortunately.
to the extreme, right?
Yeah, to the extreme. So, if somebody is striving for muscle growth, if you're trying to do that in a calorically restricted state, I think you're going to limit your capacity to grow muscle, and probably also just your general enjoyment and your performance. Like all of those things are going to be compromised. And again, the degree to which probably depends on how long that diet phase is, how much, total body mass you've lost, and other factors like that. But it's interesting. If we were to and I try to refer back to the research and what we actually see, The most recent paper that I read was by Helms and colleagues, and they were reviewing, a fixed resistance training program under different caloric states. So there was a group that were just at their calculated maintenance for this training intervention. There was a group that ate in a modest surplus, and then there was a group that ate in a high surplus. And what was really interesting was that the hypertrophy response between those groups was actually insignificant. Now, I might argue that the study design perhaps wasn't as great as it could have been. I don't know whether the program that they implemented with these participants was necessarily geared up to have them make meaningful muscle growth changes. I don't know whether the volume was quite high enough for this group of resistance trained individuals. But my theories, and again, I can't say that I've seen any data on this, but anecdotally through the work that I've done with clients, and maybe you've experienced this too, I think that the ability for somebody to build muscle might actually come down to their starting body fat percentages or their current body composition. So my hypothesis would be that, and again, I have to pick a line in the sand here. So I'm going to say 25% body fat. If you are above 25% body fat, I think even if you are at maintenance calories, I believe based on what I have seen with clients over the last 2 decades of working one-on-one with people, and for myself too, I do believe that these individuals can make meaningful progress in terms of building muscle because they have, they have residue body fat. They have an energy source on their person that they can utilize to, build that foundational muscle. Conversely, the leaner we get, there's less of a reservoir of energy. There's less adipose tissue that can be used for the provision of energy and to build muscle. I suspect that the leaner we get, sub 25% body fat, I think it becomes significantly more difficult to build an appreciable amount of muscle in that state if you're not then providing, that energy through dietary means. So I do think it's possible for people to build muscle even at maintenance and probably even in a deficit in some cases. But that probably depends on their, baseline characteristics. For the leaner individual, if they are trying to also create a deficit, it'd be like if I today, I'm 4 weeks out from a competition, there is probably very little chance that I'm building any muscle right now. I'm just trying to hang on to dear life for what I've got because I don't have a whole lot of energy reserves to fuel, the building of more muscle tissue. So I think you were talking, was your original question about strength?
No, it was about the confusion over how should I train in different phases. And what you just said was, depending on the energy stores you have in your body, right? The more fat to lose, the easier it is probably to build muscle without being in a huge surplus. And the leaner you are, you need a surplus. I guess the sub question for that is, should people train differently in fat loss?
My answer would probably be no, with a few minor caveats. So I'd say that, if your goals are unchanged, so if you still have the goals of building a fantastic set of quads or a gigantic set of biceps, the program that you implement during a fat loss phase would still be the same program that you implement during a muscle building phase. The key differences would be that you're probably not going to quite get the same, response to that, program if you're in the extreme calorie deficit and you're a really lean person. The caveat might be that due to low energy availability and perhaps inadequate micronutrient intake, your recovery probably isn't going to be as good, during that, calorie deficit. So I would say that the training probably needs to be geared towards a more modest approach. So for instance, I do not ever program, or very rarely, I shouldn't say ever, I do not program very often when I'm dieting, RPE 10 or RPE 9 even. I try to train within an appropriate, or at an appropriate intensity, but not so high that I, injure myself, because my injury risk would be heightened during a calorically restricted state. So I think the intensity at which I train is probably a little bit less. And then the other thing I think that's important to consider is that when you are dieting and you're calorically restricted, your performance is going to suffer at some point. You might start to see performance decrements. What you were able to lift at the beginning of your training block 8 weeks in and you're dieting might be noticeably different because you don't have the same energy levels to kind of get in and train really hard. And that's also problematic for dieting too, because we do start to see trends down in how much energy you're actually expending during your workouts when you're in that calorically restricted state too. So it makes it harder and harder to lose fat, the lower your calories and the longer you've been dieting. So it's a tough situation to navigate.
It absolutely is. And I know from personal experience right now, because I'm also in a fat loss phase for the last 4 weeks or so, kind of a mini cut, which is very, very aggressive. And you go in with high hopes that you're going to continue your training just like you were doing. And you're like, I need to cut volume here because there's just nothing left, even with the banana right before your workout or whatever. So calories are just so low. So people need to understand that. But then also getting back to the other side, the muscle building side, it implies that there's potentially a lot of opportunity for women to spend time in that type of phase, not gaining, tens and tens of pounds and lots of fat, right? But doing it in a lean, healthy way.
Before I started working with Philip, I had been trying to lose weight and was really struggling with consistency. But from the very beginning, Philip took the time to listen to me and understand my goals. He taught me the importance of fueling my body with the right foods to optimize my training in the gym, and I lost 20 pounds. More importantly, I gained self-confidence. What sets Philip apart is the personal connection. He supported and encouraged me every step of the way. So if you're looking for a coach who cares about your journey as much as you do, I highly recommend Philip Pape.
What are your general, we could spend a whole episode talking about muscle building, the what to do, and I've talked about it as well, but what are your top 3 principles, I guess I would say, for someone wanting to do their first serious muscle building phase?
I can't stress enough the importance of patience. And I think once somebody understands the reality of speed at which a muscle grows, I think that can be really helpful. A lot of people don't have a solid understanding of what's realistic. So, when I mentioned to somebody, it is really like watching paint dry. I mentioned before, 0.2 to 0.3 of a centimeter is what we would typically observe in the average 8 to 12 week study intervention. So I'll say, okay, we're going to do a 3-month build. I'm like, do you think that you could see 3 millimeters if I were to tell you to look in the mirror? And most of them will say, oh, probably not. So then I might say to them, okay, well, what about 6 months if we do a 6-month build? And, you didn't have any interruptions. You consistently trained that entire way through. Maybe now you've acquired 0.6 of a centimeter. Do you think that you could see that in the mirror? And some of them might say yes, others might say no, but I'll always push back and say, well, if you've got body fat, and most of us do during a build, I would encourage you to have some body fat if you're going to do a build so that you've got the energy to train hard. But most of us wouldn't be able to see even that kind of a change because we have a layer of body fat sitting over that muscle. So I think that it's a challenging phase because you can't see the rewards immediately like you can when you're dieting. There's that instant gratification when you start to see body fat stripping away, but you can't really see muscle growing. So I think, patience is so important. And I know I sound like a broken record in my check-ins to my clients, but I'm like, this is eat, sleep, train, repeat right now. And make sure that you enjoy what you're doing so that you do consistently show up and keep at this. And I think reminding folks that the benefits may not be visible now. This is like your short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. But for every 1 kilogram of muscle that somebody puts on, you're able to increase your basal metabolic rate by somewhere in the measure of 22 to 25 calories per kg. So on the front end, that doesn't sound very meaningful, right? So let's say you put on 4 kgs. Or 5 kilograms. We're talking 100 calorie increase to your BMR. But it's when you then move that more muscular body and you just go about your day-to-day activities or you do the same lifting program that you've been doing for a few years in that more muscular body, now it burns so many more calories because it's moving. And it makes it so much easier in the future to actually achieve your fat loss goals because without changing anything to how much exercise you do, you might do the same cardio, same 5-day training split, same incidental movement, but your body's like a guzzling truck that's just, incredibly inefficient. It uses a lot of energy. So it's so much easier to burn fat and then maintain a leaner physique once you've acquired the muscle. But again, I think so many women get stuck on, but I want to see my leaner self. I want to be lean. For every week that they diet, that could have been a week chasing the muscle that they ultimately need.
No, it does. And that's like an investment in years and years and years of much easier living, dieting, whatever you're trying to do after that. Like you said, we did an episode not long ago called like 10 ways muscle burns more calories beyond what you think or something. That was looking into the research beyond just the cost of the tissue that you mentioned, right? The in American units, right? 10 around 10 calories per pound.
Yes.
But same thing, where there's other things happening, some that we don't even understand, right? There seems to be other mechanisms, signaling mechanisms and such that cause us to burn more calories because we have more muscle, not to mention just standing around with more body weight because you're leaner at a higher body weight, you're burning more muscle. That's pretty cool. And then the patience of doing it and getting through it, and you as a coach saying, look, just keep doing what you're doing and focus on the process. That's all I can help you with right now. And as a coach, you're probably like, I wish there was some other special magic thing I can mention this week. But there isn't. Just like keep it up.
Yeah, I think for men and women too, though. I mean, I work with dozens of guys as well. Some compete competitively, others are just gen pop, wanting to be healthier, live a better quality life. But I think even the males struggle with, not necessarily being at their lean, shredded physique too. I mean, I get just as much or close to the same kind of pushback, having a little bit of the tummy tire or, excess body fat. But yeah, I think this is why it's also important to have a coach or to do the work yourself, whether it's through listening to audio, podcasts, reading, that help you improve your overall confidence and like self-worth. I know a lot of the client coaching sessions with my clients are just helping them, recognize their value outside of their physique and kind of talk them off the cliff that they're sitting on because they feel so unhappy in how they look visibly. But we then focus on their performance and, how they're feeling and their confidence in, being consistent and all these other things. So, yeah, there are different focuses, I think, in a building phase and different challenges. Again, I think the biggest thing is just having patience as your muscle is growing.
Yeah. And you just mentioned one way to maybe support that patience with some, I'll call it instant gratification or short-term thinking, is tracking the right things, that because there are things that do change more quickly that you could celebrate. What would those be? What would be the big things that most people should be tracking?
I would say, if they're open to doing like macro tracking, I think knowing and feeling confident in your decisions around your nutrition is helpful. Knowing that you're getting a sufficient amount of protein in is really important. For some of my clients, they just track protein and calories. Others are tracking, all macros. But I think that gives confidence and, helps them in trusting the process. If they know that these are my current calories, this is intended to keep my weight, relatively stable, or at least they've got a trajectory of where they're heading. And each week they can look at their data and go, yep, okay, what's happening is supposed to be happening. So yeah, caloric tracking, nutrition tracking, I think is really important, protein especially. And then from a training standpoint, and this is not something I always used to do, I probably only implemented it in the last maybe 8 to 10 years of my practice, is tracking energy expenditure like within a workout. So I mean, many of us wear Apple Watches, Garmin's, Fitbits, tracking how much energy you expend in your workouts and just looking at the relative changes week over week. And then if you're open to it, I also have some of my clients that like data, do the same thing, with their steps. We'll track relative changes from week to week so they can kind of see and make sense of why, their weight might have gone up a little bit more this week than others. And it could be very easily distinguishable because, oh, look at that. My average steps this week were 4,000 less than last week. Or, oh, I'll see all those sessions that I missed because I was busy doing things with the kids. Oh, well, that amounted to 1,000 calories less than last week. Oh, well, naturally, that's why my weight went up a little bit. So I think having that data can be validating because it helps us make sense of why things are happening. I think tracking fiber is another really important one that obviously influences scale weight significantly. So I think one of the things that a lot of my clients have been, I guess, grateful for is me being able to point out like, why, their weight went down or why it went up in response to massive fluctuations in just food choice. I'm like, guys, this isn't even a bad thing. Like, here's why you gained weight. It has nothing to do with body fat. So data certainly can be a positive thing, especially if this is a long 6 to 12 month game plan of building, so that you can make sense of the changes, and that gives confidence.
Yeah.
And I think just from a training standpoint, having some physical challenges that you can work towards too. It's one thing to just look at yourself in the mirror, but to have something that you can tangibly try to improve in terms of strength, picking a few key focus lifts and, getting into the gym and having a performance-based goal, I think is also incredibly valuable during that building phase. Otherwise, it just becomes very monotonous and repetitive.
Yeah, it's kind of meandering and aimless at that point. I totally know what you mean. It could be a PR on a lift, or it could be, hey, I'm going to do my first unassisted pull-up or whatever it might be. One thing I want to ask about, you said energy expenditure in your workouts. Why do you track that specifically? And I ask for two reasons. One is the inaccuracy of some of this data on wearables, to be honest. But then the other is, what are you trying to measure? Because I would suspect measuring volume, tonnage, things like that are a good indicator of like your lifting progress, but what are you trying to measure with that expenditure?
Yeah, so the reason that I would track energy expenditure, and I want to just point out, you are 1000% correct about these wrist-worn devices being largely inaccurate. I'm not looking at those necessarily for their absolute number. So I don't believe when I see somebody's done, 5,000 calories of energy expenditure across the week from their lifting and their cardio, that's actually true and correct. I'm looking at the relative change from week to week, and again, if they're at maintenance, I want to be able to say to them, your energy balance has stayed pretty consistent this week. And thus there shouldn't be anything to worry about in terms of your body composition changing. And again, a lot of my clients are worried if in their building phase that I'm suddenly putting on all this body fat. So it's nice to have that data to show them, hey, look, for the last 5 weeks of your, training, you've had very consistent week to week energy expenditures. So, there's no reason to believe that you've put on body fat. And then the volume tracking, that's really nice if you train in the same location with the same equipment. I find that I place less value and weight in volume if I've got a client that is traveling, every week of their year because of their work. And they're in different gyms where the machines all load a bit differently. So, I think the volume tracking has its place if you do and are somebody that has a gym that you train at consistently and you're following a structured program, because then you can actually see like you're making progress in said lift. If you've got your overhead shoulder press, you've been working on that. I mean, you can see your volume increasing week over week. But
those are all fair points. And I asked about the energy thing because I'm gonna start using that with my clients. Honestly, I've always dismissed it because of the inaccuracy and like trying to understand the value. But if you take the totality of as a proxy for just your overall activity and energy flux, it's great. And it goes beyond just steps, right? Because it kind of includes everything. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Some of the clients will use, some of theirs just run in the background. So they'll give me their total daily estimated energy expenditure. I probably use that less, but I do like it for if you've got a 6-week or a 9-week program, as you said, that you're following consistently. If like, I like to look at, well, what was your energy expenditure for these sessions this week?
For the sessions, yes.
And sometimes you will see noticeable differences, and it might be, my kid had me up all night, I didn't sleep, or I have been unwell, and you can see the changes week over week, even though it's the same program, that can help provide a reasonable justification for why their weight might be moving around a little bit. So, I find that very helpful.
Got it. No, I love that stuff. We're all about data, and I'm always trying to discover new things to track, HRV over here and this over there. Do you have like 5 minutes just to we can wrap? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the one thing I kind of was going to lead part of this discussion with was more about time efficiency. And the conversation actually took a really nice direction in other very critical topics. But I did want to get back to if women are stressed, they have a stressful life, busy life. I'm sure lots of women in your, client base are trying to find the time to work out. We know it's important, but there's also a limit with kids and with family or with work. What is, I'll say, the minimum effective dose, right? Or minimum viable product, whatever, with time in the gym or number of sessions or length of sessions where you still can get amazing results for hypertrophy?
Yeah, so it does depend on someone's training status. So for like beginners, brand new to lifting, the first time stepping in the gym, then the number of sets that you would need per muscle group per week is probably somewhere between 10 to 15 sets. So it's actually quite difficult to prioritize every single muscle group, believe it or not. Otherwise, you'd probably be living in the gym, and even more so if you're an advanced lifter. But to just generalize, if you've got, say, 3 key areas you want to grow, and you're time poor and you're a beginner, then just make sure that those 3 key muscle groups you are doing somewhere between 10 and 15 sets per week, and that you're distributing them over a minimum of like 2 days or 2 days training frequency. What we tend to see is once you perform more than, say, 9 hard working sets when taken to failure within a single session on one muscle group. So example, quads, you wouldn't want to do 4 quad exercises taking you to 12 sets in that same session. There starts to be diminishing returns. So we don't necessarily see any additional benefits in terms of hypertrophy beyond that. So I personally stick to like 6 to 9 sets maximum on one muscle group before I move on. But for advanced lifters, those numbers are quite a bit higher. And I would say probably somewhere between 20 and 30 working sets or direct sets taken close or to failure per muscle group per week. So I have found in my experience, I can usually only fit about 2 or 3 focus muscle groups up in that kind of volume range before I run out of days in the week to train. So everything else kind of then takes a back seat. So if I pick my glutes and my shoulders and maybe my quads as my focus muscle groups, that's going to take up a few days of your training. So, you know, all of the other groups might end up being just at maintenance volume. So that would be somewhere between, you know, 0 and 10 sets per week would probably, well, I should say 3 sets to 10 sets per week would help you to maintain your current muscle mass as an advanced lifter. So that's kind of how I would encourage somebody to think about their training week if they're time poor, and then to utilize like efficient training strategies. So I mentioned before, like the benefits of potentially relying on like female biology, capitalize on short rest periods. We have this innate ability, at least it seems, in some research, to have shorter rest. So provided that your recovery allows you to perform 8 or more repetitions in your subsequent sets, you know, even if you've had 30 seconds recovery, that still leads to the same kind of growth response as resting for 3 minutes. Now, I know some people love resting for long periods. Go for it. You'll probably have a much higher total volume, but that doesn't inherently mean that you're going to get more muscle growth. So yeah, I opt for short rest periods when I'm busy. I'm usually only in the gym like 4 times a week for about 60 minutes myself. So that plays a really important part in getting in and getting out and still getting a really effective workout.
That's good. I mean, people, it's good to understand that this is accessible for anyone at any training age, even as an advanced. And by the time you get to be an advanced lifter, you're probably so into it that you're going to find the time anyway. That's my take on it. But you know, your app, Be a Fit, is I know new and improved and got lots of great features. How does that play into how people train and help them do this?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about it. So we launched a product last year, actually, and unfortunately we had to take it off the market for various reasons that I can't discuss today, but I have a new business partner and we basically rebuilt this thing bigger and better, and it is incredible. So we have hundreds of different training programs with many different focuses. So I believe we have strength focused programs, hypertrophy, cardio, mobility and warm-up programs, and catered to different experience levels. And all the programs implement an evidence-based approach, and it's got so many really cool features. So one of the things that I always found frustrating when I used to be a personal trainer back when I was like 18 years old was I'd write a program for a client and they were like, I don't have that piece of equipment. So the app actually has a replace exercise feature where if you use this little button, it will show you every other exercise in our entire, workout library that targets the same primary muscle group as the movement you're trying to replace. So you don't have to guess your exercise. It'll show you these are the 50 or 60 other movements that'll target that muscle group. So that's been really a really great tool. We've also got a brand new build your own workout feature. So for those that are more advanced and just want to kind of dabble in having a nice platform for your programs as opposed to putting them in Excel sheets, it does that. But it's got so many cool features, and I can't wait to keep adding more.
Great. Yeah. And look, if someone's listening and you're looking for a workout program based on evidence-based principles, and by the way, the 2 pain points you just talked about from personal experience are big pain points, like swapping exercises. I do it all the time, whether I'm following my own program or someone else's, I'll need to do it. And most apps, you just have to know and then search for it. And so that is really cool. And then I know you have like meal friendly or macro friendly food in there as well. So for people that are trying to get an one-stop shop for everything, it sounds like a great app. So we're gonna throw that in there. Is there anything else you wish we had covered, Holly, before we adjourn?
Oh my gosh, there's so many things.
Okay,
Maybe
sure.
we're chatting. No, not right now.
Okay, no, that's all good. Where do you want people to find you? I mean, we'll definitely throw the app in there. Where else do you want them to hit you up?
I think most things you're able to discover on my Instagram platform, but I'm on YouTube. I always do educational videos on YouTube. That's kind of my pride and joy over on that platform. But I put lots of content out on Instagram. We've got our website. We've got the app links and everything available right there. So that's just Holly T. Baxter.
Cool. All right. We'll keep it simple through the app, the YouTube, the IG. People can reach out to you. Thank you so much for coming on. These are always really good topics to revisit because there's so many myths out there and so much nonsense. And I like your measured, evidence-based approach, but it's still super flexible and anyone can do this. So thank you, Holly, for bringing your expertise to the show.
Thank you. I had a great time.